They were waiting on the porch the night my daughter stopped answering me. The first line is small, a whisper of lacquer and dust. A row of cracked faces pressed into the dim light like an accusation. I remember the way the porch light pooled on their dresses, how the shadows swallowed their eyes until the dolls looked less like toys and more like holes in the world. I stood there with the door half open, cigarette ash tumbling across my palm, and for a single, stupid second, I convinced myself someone was playing a joke. There was no laughter on the other side of the street, only the distant hum of the city and the steady, patient creak of the porch swing. Inside my head, everything rearranged itself into a list of ordinary things. The bills on the table, the kettle waiting on the stove, the calendar with last month's coffee stain. Outside that list, under and behind it, something else had started measuring me. It moved quietly at first, a smell like old paper and wet wood, the soft susurration of silk against silk. The dolls' hair hung in limp, filthy waves. Their dresses were the color of stale milk. Their faces were painted with that same brittle, antiquated smile. And yet there was something beneath the paint I couldn't name. A map of hairline cracks webbed across porcelain cheeks, tiny rivers leading inward. I remember how I stepped closer and felt my jaw go slack. Each doll's eyes seemed to have been hollowed out, not by age but by intent. Pitted, black caverns that drank the light. When I leaned in, trying to find the seam where craftsmanship became menace, I heard a noise that I could not place. A soft, ceremonial shuffle, like the rustling of skirts in a long, empty hall. It came from the line, as if they'd shifted their weight. My breath misted in the cold air, and for the first time I imagined them turning their faces toward my house, and with the deliberateness of someone closing a book, watching me from across the threshold. The first odd thing that happened that week involved a single, inexplicable footprint on the kitchen linoleum. A tiny, pale crescent pressed into flour. There were no tracks leading to it, and none leading away. I told myself it was a child playing, a stray animal, the wind carrying some absurd thing through an open window. I told myself a lot of things, and the list grew longer, less convincing. When my phone buzzed later, a message with only a location pin and a time, my hands shook so badly I could barely read the coordinates. They pointed to the old toy factory, the one everyone in town pretended not to remember. I should have thrown the phone against the wall. Instead, I stood at the sink, listening to the house settle, and wondering whether my daughter ever stood in a room like this, listening too. After that night, the house stopped being mine. I started keeping the lights on, as if illumination were a ward against something that lived between the shadows. Daylight helped only a little. The light seemed to fall away from certain corners, like a hand peeling off a bandage. I found new anomalies every morning, a small smear of soot on the hallway wall, as if a tiny face had rubbed itself there. A single shoe tucked under the radiator, the static hiss of the radio when no station should be there. Once, standing at the threshold of my daughter's room, I noticed the wallpaper's pattern repeated itself in the dust on the floor. The faint impression of a row, like footprints too small to belong to anyone living. Then came the voices. They started as echoes in the thin hours when sleep loosened its grip. At first I thought it was the television, or the upstairs neighbor's television, or the pipes, but the sounds were layered and deliberate, a whisper of syllables stitched together into nonsense. One night I recorded the audio on my phone because I needed proof, because sanity is a currency that only has value if you can spend it. Playback offered nothing but static and a faint, warped lullaby that slid into the spaces between my words. When I slowed it down, there was a pulse underneath, breathing, measured, patient. At the very end, someone, or something, hissed my name. The hairs on my arms lifted, as if someone had just drawn a cold finger down my spine. I began to see them everywhere. Not the dolls as they sat on shelves, though more of them appeared. A head balanced on a kitchen chair, one propped in a crumpled umbrella stand, but partial signs, the residue of them. Tiny handprints on the glass of the back door, half moons in the flower on the counter, the faint impression of a dress in the mud at the foot of my garden. One afternoon, I opened a drawer and found a tiny, brittle photograph tucked behind a stack of receipts, a school picture of my daughter, her smile the same as always, except someone, or something, had painted the irises out, filling them with black ink that bled into the paper like spilled oil. People started to notice the change in me before I did. My sister called and said I sounded hollow. My boss suggested time off. I laughed when he recommended a therapist, but kept the number in my phone like a talisman. I stopped leaving the house. When I did, the feeling followed me, a cool pressure at the back of my neck, the sense that I was being measured in increments no one else could see. At night, I would wake to the sound of small feet padding down the hallway, a procession that never reached the living room and never left any prints. Then I found the row. I was walking past the living room with a mug of coffee when I saw them through the doorway. A line of dolls standing shoulder to shoulder in the center of the floor, dresses mismatched and hair matted, their empty eyes fixed on me like a covenant. They were facing the window, backs to the room, as if they had just marched in and turned to stand watch. I could see for the first time how they had been arranged, not haphazardly, but with an order that felt ritualistic. At the head of the line, where a child's face should have been, there was a small hand pressed into the wooden floor, palm down and stubborn, as if someone had been holding the wood from underneath. I dropped the mug. It shattered, and the warm scent of coffee mixed with the sour metallic tang of panic. One doll tilted its head. The sound it made was the scraping of porcelain against oak, but when it turned its face, I could have sworn there was movement in the darkness behind its eyes. The house held its breath. Something in the hallway moved, not footsteps, but a slow, deliberate scrape, and then, impossibly, a child humming, soft and close enough that the hairs on my forearms sang with static. I thought the row was the end of it, an answer I could face and break. I was wrong. That night, I followed the sound of the humming down into the basement because courage, like hunger, arrives sudden and unreasonable. The cellar door smelled of damp paper and old glue. My flashlight made the dust tremble in thin ribbons. As I reached the bottom step, the light caught something that made my vision tilt. A string of chairs, tiny and splintered, arranged like pews, every seat occupied by a doll. Their faces gleamed in the beam. Not vacant now, but active, the hairline cracks spread thin like dried rivers. In the center, where a child should have been, sat my daughter. She was smaller than I remembered, her dress the same faded blue from her school pictures, but when she turned her head, the angle felt wrong, as if the neck had been loosened and rewired. Her eyes were black wells. I called her name, and the sound ricocheted off the stone. She did not move. Instead, all the dolls shifted as one. Their mouths opened in a soundless chorus, and the humming swelled into a lullaby that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I reached for her and felt something brush my fingers, the brittle scrape of porcelain, then flesh that was not quite flesh. A coldness pushed up my arm, and I staggered back into the circle of chairs, tripping over cedar chips and a child's mitten. The flashlight skittered, fell, and the room contracted into a core of dark. I do not remember the first time I screamed. Memory after that is a series of small betrayals, the weight of a tiny hand in mine, the texture of china against my knuckles, the way my knees gave as if someone had removed my name from the ledger of the living. My daughter leaned forward, and the sound that left her was the same noise I had heard on the porch months ago. Not words, but the precise cadence of a promise. The dolls around us arranged themselves into a procession, circling with the slow, ceremonial patience of something that has practiced this motion for decades. They did not look at me with hatred. They looked at me with the steadiness of a mechanic fitting parts together. There was a moment, a single breath where I felt the world tilt and a seam opened at the edge of my vision. I understood then. They did not want to take me away. They were offering me a place. It was a kind of mercy, the way a storm offers a body shelter by hollowing a tree. Their palms were cool against my skin and impossibly comforting. I tried to wrench free, to bargain with the one solid fact I had left, that I was a father, but the lullaby filled my ribs and the air tasted of powdered chalk and old ink. When the first crack spidered across my cheek, sharp and inevitable, I thought of all the ordinary things I had kept, the kettle, the unpaid bills, the calendar with the coffee stain, and how small they seemed under the weight of what wanted to be whole again. The dolls hummed, patient as funeral bells, and my daughter smiled with a face that was no longer only hers. They always save a seat.
Subscribe to Horror Story Bar.